Okay, I'm going to start the webinar now.
Welcome everybody to our last webinar of the year. We've got a wonderful lineup for our theme of biodiversity in farmlands and in grasslands. We're going to start with a collaboration between Shelley Fuller, Marika Hoenig, and Rupert Koopman. They will share their presentation time, and then we'll be ending off with Ivan van der Walt, who will speak to us about grassland. So we're moving across the country. For me, I just wanted to welcome you all. I know this time of year is getting very crazy, and we're delighted to have such a large participation today. And one of the things I wanted to start with was to introduce you, just get my camera to focus on it, is bot socks. I don't know if you've heard of or seen bot socks, but they're a collaboration. Whoa, I'm struggling. It's the focus that is bugging. Should I put it next to my face? Nope, I'm not going to win. These are bot socks, very, very clever, with a beautiful botanical design on them. They're the one of many designs that will be coming up, and it is in conjunction with Sexy Socks. So what's wonderful about bot socks for Christmas gifts or for yourselves is that Sexy Socks, whenever you buy a pair of socks, they donate socks to people in need, people who need socks. And so one is equal to two. And besides the fact they're really gorgeous, there we are, I got it. They're a really great design. So they'll be available from Catherine Gribble, the fundraiser for the Botanical Society National, and at the Kirstenbosch Botanical Society bookshop. And with that very fuzzy introduction, we're going to start with Shelley, Marika, and Rupert. All three come with a massive reputations. Shelley is sorry, I'm just going to catch up. She has specialized in the environmental field for over 15 years with a specific focus on sustainable agriculture, ecological restoration, and supply chain sustainability and climate change mitigation. It's lots of big topical subjects. She thoroughly enjoys the work she does within the conservation and agricultural space, and what they're presenting today will be focusing on that. Rupert hardly needs introduction. He is a field botanist, but he's made it his life's work to help protect the plant diversity of the Cape Floral Kingdom. Rupert, welcome. It's lovely to have you back. And Marika is a botany expert, and she draws her inspiration from nature, She says she's equally passionate about the urban ecosystem as she is about the wild felt areas, and she is a well-known published author. So over to the three of you. Shelley, I believe you'll be starting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Cherise, and thank you for an amazing opportunity. I'm going to start the presentation, but I am just one of an amazing crew. And yeah, thank you for your time in this busy schedule. It's wonderful to be able to share with you this cool project I worked on with Marika and Rupert. So we'll do a little bit of a whirlwind tour and keep some time at the end for interaction and questions, and be able to have a bit of discussion, I hope. So yeah, the project has basically been going over the last year and a bit between the three of us. The topic is farming with biodiversity, and it really was a team effort. It kind of happened over a couple of coffees and brainstorming sessions. I've known Rupert and Marika for a number of years, but this was the first project that we were really able to dig into together. And so for this evening's presentation, I'll just do a brief intro. Then I'll hand over to Rupert to do a little bit more about the importance of place and why the project was started as well, and what's so important about the work. And then hand over to Marika to chat about the different sections within the booklet that is hot off the press, talking about the plant palettes and the case studies, and then ending off about where we go to from here, because we quickly realized that this booklet, which kind of started as a species list and just totally evolved from there, is needing to be an online resource. But essentially it started because we're trying to showcase the ability to build back biodiversity. Most of the time we think about biodiversity just above ground, the incredible flora and fauna that we have in this country. But equally, we were wanting to profile quite a lot within the working landscapes, the agricultural landscapes, how important it is to look underground, to the hidden biodiversity underground. And yeah, the idea sparked when it's from 2021, this report from WWF International called Farming with Biodiversity. It was really just trying to profile that there's a flip side. Obviously, globally, the way we produce and consume our food has the biggest impact on biodiversity loss in the world. But equally, working landscapes can have a huge opportunity to restore the function. So trying to promote an alternative approach to farming that is much more focused on nature positive production. So really focusing on managing the way you farm the land, restoring and rehabilitating, and then protecting what's left of those ecosystem functions. And so we realized that obviously within South Africa, we've got to try and showcase some examples as well. And there's a lot out there as soon as you start chatting to people and driving around the countryside. And with the fact that in South Africa, a large portion of the area that needs to be conserved is in the hands of private or communal landowners, we realized that we really need to be able to showcase what's possible, and also just to show that, because I think if people think of regenerative agriculture, all these big terms, it's not always practical and they don't know where to start. So we came together and thought, okay, how do we showcase through case studies? And using the program that we have at WWF called the Conservation Champions, we realized that if we looked at a map and tried to provide examples across different regions, these are 60 farms that provide an example of different vegetation types and different practices, and really just showcasing the learnings along the way. So the intention was really to try and encourage the farmers that we work with, and general landowners, gardeners even, to just look at their land through a different lens. So the target audience for this project and for the booklet is the farming community, and to just just frame their land and the view of their land specifically through the biodiversity lens. And as I said, a lot of the conservation champions are already doing that, and many other farms that I'm sure you know about as well. So basically, it was a Green Trust funded project, and this was one element of the work. And as I mentioned in the beginning, it started off as a species list. And we thought, well, everyone just wants to know what I can start planting with. What are the easy wins within my region? And so then we thought, well, how do we make a species list according to soils? And which ones are the easy ones? And then we got down a rabbit hole of genetics and things like that. So it did evolve, and then hence the idea of using case studies and examples, practical examples, and using a storytelling way of writing. And that's why it was amazing to work with Marika as the lead author. And then bring in the voices of the farmers, and those we met along the way, in terms of sharing their knowledge and just getting something out there that's a starting point. So we had a lot of fun field trips. It was pretty much a year ago that we started cruising around in a vehicle through different sections of the Cape Winelands, visiting the conservation champion farms and other leading farms that they kind of mentioned as neighbors. And yeah, this booklet could not have been possible without the passion and the knowledge and the information that was so freely given to us each time we visited a farm. So we're very grateful to the farmers, the farm managers, the landowners, the researchers, soil scientists, everyone that we had coffee with along the way. And yeah, it was really inspiring. I mean, unfortunately, most of the time I sit behind my computer, and so the days we were out in the fields, listening and observing, taking pictures, scribbling and asking questions, it was really inspirational. And yeah, the whole time just trying to view these landscapes as working landscapes, but also opportunities to bring back life, to bring back the biodiversity, and just to help the busy farmers that actually are in a business of producing a crop, to just learn from nature, to look around, to see what's growing there already as a cover crop, and how they can try and experiment and bring some of that learning to their neighbors. Yeah, so we went cruising around, had a look at what was there. Marika was great at collecting little samples, and that effectively rolled into what became the plant palettes for different uses. Where we started off, this project for the Green Trust was looking at how we promote species being replanted specifically for bee forage. So we started off looking at which ones are good for bees and other pollinators. And then, of course, we were looking at cover crops and habitat hedges and screens and replacement for windbreaks. And every time we went to another farm, they said, you know, I'd really like to try and reintroduce indigenous species for this use. And so it was really trying to be as practical as possible, and then also trying to widen the net so we were covering as many different regions as possible within our incredible felt types. So it is just a starting point, but it was effectively 11 different case studies listed there, from Hartenberg in the Bottleret Hills Conservancy area to Robertson felt types with De Wetshof and Voorspoort. And we have now published this book online. I've shared it in the chat, and you can have a look afterwards. And I encourage you to download it, and we'll also chat about where else you can get access to the booklet. But effectively, even though it's in printed form for now and in a PDF on our website, we are wanting it to be an online resource. We quickly learned that there's always more case studies, there's always more examples, there's always more stories to tell. And so ideally now we're looking for collaboration and partners to be able to bring this into an online version, almost like a layer on Cape Farm Mapper or something like that, where you can click on examples and yeah, to inspire others and to make it a live version of these case studies. So just to brief through the contents of the booklet. So part one really covers the basics, and again, trying not to be too technical, but covering some of the important topics of biodiversity on farms, the value of biodiversity in these working landscapes, but equally the impact of agriculture and the trend of doing less, so the regenerative agriculture topic. And then looking through a biodiversity lens, and then farming within this critical hotspot, covering some of the terminology that often comes up in terms of distinction between rehabilitation and restoration, and then some practical examples of how to enhance biodiversity within your farming landscapes. We also covered quite a bit about growing plants. So obviously one thing is identifying a plant list to reintroduce or to bring back, but quite often the challenge is there's not enough local indigenous species at the nurseries available. So that is also a next step of how we grow these regional nurseries, how we expand a little section in the commercial nurseries that you know about to just bring back more of the local indigenous stock. And then trying to get a resource list to contact the specialists near you. And then the second part is beautiful palettes outlined just like in Mareka's other book in terms of the different uses, riverine areas, intercropping, habitat hedges, security, forage for bees and other insects, old abandoned fields that the farms want to bring back into the local indigenous belt, and then also road verges as any opportunity really to bring biodiversity back. And so on that note, I'm going to hand over to Rupert to just dig into part one. Thanks.
Good. Thanks, Shal. Right. So then we have to zoom out a bit and see, this is a standard thing to a Botanical Society audience, but it bears repeating in terms of how biodiversity is spread here in the Cape, and also for the rest of the country, actually, if you're looking at other habitats. So most of the Western Cape threatened species and ecosystems are in these regions where the intensive agriculture happens, and the private landowners are the largest custodians of that habitat. And so how do you then reconcile this reintroduction of it? So next slide, please, Shelley. And then it becomes a kind of value-laden statement in terms of a lot of times you would have heard people like Odette Curtis talking about how farmers look at it in Oosterveld as uitvalgrond. And the fact that these areas are looked at as messy, when people think about indigenous, they want beautifully manicured spaces like the botanical gardens, and the stuff right next to the production lands is actually where a lot of the interesting plants and habitats are. But sometimes the management of those two things is not the same. So if you think about where we are in the fynbos, fire is a management thing you've got to think about. So ideally, you do not want fire to come right up to the edge of your vineyards or orchards. And then that's where the practicality and the pragmatism comes in. So pragmatism in terms of we'd love to have amazing biodiversity throughout production lands, but in some places it won't be there. And then the practicality goes around the sourcing of the plants, what's possible. But this is intended to be the beginning of a conversation rather than the end. Thanks, Shelley. And so you got to go and do your homework. So it's looking at what's needed on a farm, biodiversity mapping, and we've got fantastic tools these days like Cape Farm Mapper, the ever-present alien invasive plants. So a lot of conservation is actually weeding. It's and that's come through in a lot of the urban work that I'm doing. Fire management, erosion control. We've had a couple of really big storm seasons in the Cape for the last couple of years where there's been incredible erosion. And so we've got to think about how infrastructure looks. Then very importantly, to create a local peer network. So there is already an informal network, and people like Johan van Biljon were very instrumental in terms of working in the landscape already, and looking then at how we enhance the reestablishment of plants in an area, and overall vegetation mapping, but vegetation or management, but management within an agricultural matrix, and not necessarily as a conservation style manage. And then, pointing out what's available, who's already growing things, what are the plants that are locally, because essentially within a production space like bottom right over there, if we're bringing back some plants into the production areas, these are the kind of plants that you need to be able to drive over with a tractor, and they should be able to survive and play a contribution. Next. And then of course on the previous slide there was iNaturalist as well, and iNaturalist is an invaluable tool because of all the work that you people are out there doing, so that we have a basic idea as to what the species are that are in an area. And so it's this thing of looking at definitions of rehabilitation versus restoration. So obviously, restoration is where you're trying to push things toward a almost a natural state again. And then rehabilitation is where you're fixing areas which are, for whichever reason, either previously plowed or burnt in a bad way, not in a good way, or eroded, but trying to then show in the toolkit what are the plants that are used there. So it's the passive restoration. So that's where you're lucky enough to have natural habitat close by, and then things will recolonize by themselves, and you can then assist that process. Active restoration, where you're going and propagating from seed and from cuttings and planting back in. And then managing expectations, because in agriculture and also in kind of formal landscaping, you've got a recipe. So you can go to the shelf, and you can go to the local agri-mark, and you can buy a recipe of things, from pesticide, herbicide, and the seed mix and so forth, and you've got a quite predictable outcome. When you're working with these natural spaces, you can get surprised. And so we need to still do quite a bit more work in terms of understanding how these restoration kind of states work. And then also the importance of fire where possible. So in this particular image, it's more in the Karoo, and fire is not really a thing. But when you are in the fynbos, are you going to use fire as a tool or not? And that almost determines what you're going to be planting. Okay, next. Right, so these are the vegetation types at the selected sites, and you'll see, generally speaking, these are not the vegetation types where the majority of indigenous plants that you can get at the nursery comes from. So we tend to have a lot of strandveld plants and mountain fynbos plants, but not really renosterveld and alluvium fynbos, which is closely allied. And most of them are also critically endangered or endangered. And so it does show that there is a potential conservation outcome towards managing these landscapes in a better way. Again, managing them as a compromise rather than hardcore managing conservation, but looking at how do we manage production lands in a way which is more nature friendly. Okay, next. Yeah, and then it's looking at how do you bring resilience back into a landscape, because we've managed our landscapes in a way where we're trying to move water off from urban and agricultural infrastructure as fast as possible. But what that means is that at some stage it overwhelms the little bits of habitat that we've left for rivers to be rivers. So this is in the Brede River Valley, and you can see, that is an old alluvial plain, and the water has just gone where it's always gone. And unfortunately, we've used modern techniques to then go into these spaces, which are productive for a lot of time. But when these big events happen, then nature comes and takes it back again. Next slide, please. And so this is from 2013, and the same thing applies on the right-hand side. You've got the vineyard pretty much underwater, and on the left is where this is the Berg River is flowing, and this wasn't even a very big rain event in 2013. And I think we are getting to that point, if you take these last two slides, where we've got to start thinking of actually, in some places, we are going to have to abandon, inverted commas, infrastructure, because the fact is that the infrastructure is put in places where they're going to be increasingly vulnerable. So we have to then replan the size of things like road culverts and lift bridges up, and properly delineate wetlands so that we can look after all the infrastructure, that's the natural infrastructure, and the built infrastructure in a way which is more sustainable going forward. Next one. Okay, and now I'm going to hand over to Marika. I just wanted to say, like Shelley said, it was so fascinating and lovely working in this multidisciplinary space where we could bounce ideas against each other in terms of practicality and so forth. So I really enjoyed the process. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Rupert. I echo what you said. It was a very fun collaboration between the three of us, and obviously with the people that we visited. And I certainly learned a lot. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the second part of the book, which is about the plant palettes. And just to quickly say that even though I trained as a botanist for the last 2 decades, I've been in the landscaping sphere. So that's the lens, I suppose, through which I've been looking at landscapes. And I also love biodiversity. And I thought, geez, why can't these farmers just plant some more biodiversity, indigenous plants to bring in birds, and especially to get the soil biology, microbiology sort of more, because I see a lot of bare soil still on farms. So that was how I kind of entered the project. And because I'd written a book called Indigenous Plant Palettes, which is really related to garden palettes, I naively thought, well, we can create palettes for farms, right? But the answer is not really. And can we go to the next slide, Shelley? Because in the process of talking to farmers and also interacting with rehabilitation specialists and with Rupert, I realized that there is actually a massive conservation angle to this. But I'll talk a little bit more about that just now. First, this slide kind of shows that there are quite a few opportunities on a farm. This is just a generic picture, obviously, of a farm. But if you've got a stream or a river, there's an opportunity there for riverine plants or biodiversity. And then intercropping, in other words, in between your crops, you could be growing stuff. And typically farmers would sow a cover crop of exotic plants, but there's an opportunity for more biodiversity there and having more indigenous plants. Road verges, there's also a need for screening. We call those habitat hedges. But whether it's screening spray drift or screening the wind or a neighbor, or there's a real opportunity there to create habitat for wildlife. Then there's a palette called security, and another one which Shelley referred to, abandoned or old fields. Apparently, as farming is becoming more efficient and more sort of technical, there are farmers are abandoning fields or choosing not to farm unproductive land. Like if the soil is just not optimal, they'd rather not waste water on that particular block and use it where the soils are better. And so that there's also a need for doing something with these old fields. So a palette, sorry, I should have probably explained that earlier, is essentially a list or a collection of plants that are used for a specific purpose or otherwise in a particular situation. So next, please. The one that has been asked, that farmers have asked for the most apparently, is for riverine areas, because there's quite a lot of money for clearing, and they soon find out that when you've cleared these alien invasives, they come back very quickly. But if you plant indigenous riverine vegetation, that assists with stabilizing the banks, but also sort of crowding out the alien invasives. So for each palette, I've put in some plant selection criteria. So for example, for riverine plants, you want plants with very strong root systems. They typically are multi-stemmed, so that when they are flooded or there's been a flood, and they can sort of what's the word, flop over sideways, or the water can run over them and they go back up afterwards. And another selection criteria is that one should use plants or species from your local catchment area, which is very important. And then, of course, it's nice to use nitrogen-fixing plants as pioneers. So those are the plant selection criteria for riverine. And then this is an example of a case study. It's actually the first one, I think, that we visited with Dr. Karina Becker, who during COVID started a little nursery. And what I found so interesting is that she identified the main sort of what she calls structural species that were necessary to do rehabilitation in her area. In this case, it was the Nerea River, which was very strategic. So in other words, you don't have to have all 50 species. She had correctly identified the 20 sort of main ones that would help to stabilize the banks and create habitat for, and then other plants can be brought in by birds and tortoises and so on. Next slide, please. Another case study for riverine was a planting that was done by Johan van Bouillon along the Breda River, sorry, just outside Tilbach. And this was quite interesting because it was at least 10 years old and had survived that recent flood. It had survived that extremely well. So that was a good example of how these areas need to be managed over time. You can't just plant and then leave it. You actually need to manage the rehabilitated areas. Next slide, please. So when it came to identifying a palette, we were very much sort of sitting on the fence. On the one hand, we want to give people a list of plants to empower landowners, but on the other hand, there's such a need to be quite very specific to your area. But in this case, we felt that with the riverine plants, we could create a sort of a generic palette for the Breda and Berg River. And in fact, there's a tool there because Johannes started a project in iNaturalist called the Breda River Restoration Project. And so there you would immediately, if you called that up, you'd already see a whole bunch of plants that are local to that area. Having said that, the plant species change depending on whether it's from the upper reaches to the middle reaches to the lower parts of the river. So even so, this recipe, as it were, for riverine wouldn't apply throughout the entire course of a river. Okay, next please. A second palette that we featured was intercropping, and here we visited 2 farms. I found this particularly excited. I've always felt that there's just far too much bare soil, and also because sometimes farmers will plant these annual cover crops and then they'll plow them in. As far as I'm concerned, that really destroys the soil biology. You actually want to try and avoid plowing if possible. So next slide, please. And a lot has been written about cover crops, but in general, people feel that perennial plants are not suitable. And farmers, I realize, are terrified of anything competing with the crop. And the prevailing paradigm is actually quite strongly that whatever you plant is going to be competing with the crop. And so it was fantastic to see that this estate manager, Christian Matthijs at the Wetshof estate, had trialed 4 different species of perennials. And he felt it was very successful and he had no problem. He wasn't competing with the vine. The vines are doing well. And he said there were huge benefits in not having to spray for weed control with herbicide. And the 4 plants they tried there was helichrysum, wild rosemary, wilde-aus, and then also regular rosemary. And then there was a second farm that belongs to the Wetshof. This one is called Bonballon. And here they had planted 2 species of feigies among the vineyards. And when I heard about that, I thought, kind of sounded a little bit like window dressing, or probably would look good for the marketing brochure. But much to my excitement and delight, the local Robertson Karoo veld was starting to seed into the roads between the vineyard. And we quickly could count at least a dozen species, and I'm sure there were many, many more coming up among these feigies. And what I found fascinating as well, there was still a lot of tongblad. In other words, this is a typical agricultural weed. And when I looked at the estate manager, sort of wondering, is he worried about that? He said, no, I don't care. And so even though perhaps it didn't look that impressive, from a looks point of view, it was from the, if you consider that for 5 years this land hadn't been plowed, I think that is hugely significant, and the biodiversity that supports. And there were little indigenous indigoferous legumes growing. There were all these bits of shale rock that they'd left in the rows between the vineyards, which then provide shelter to little arthropods, and also especially those bacteria. Apparently UV is one of the big is very harmful to the soil biology and bacteria in the soil. And so if you have plant cover, then the UV is no longer killing off the microbes. Next slide, please. So you'll see, notice the background when it's in beige, that was more like a case study. This, we couldn't really say this is a palette of plants, because how many of these farms are actually on Robertson Karoo Veld? Well, quite a few of them, only if you're in that particular area. Whereas when you see it on a white background, that was our attempt to do a more generic palette. And this one was exceptionally difficult to do because, where do you start? Again, it is better to use local plants, but I do think obviously favoring legumes which have nitrogen fixing bacteria makes sense. Favoring perhaps grasses that aren't too invasive, because that's creating your biomass. You want to be able to mow your cover and put it down as a mulch. And obviously mat forming plants like Octotus or Garzania would also be a good idea. So that's really what that shows. Next, please. And then the last one I'll talk about is habitat hedges. So we're just promoting this idea of planting diverse sort of shrubby planting as habitat for wildlife. Next slide, please. And here, once again, we did try and offer a palette of typical plants that are found in areas where vineyards are grown. And you'll notice there are these little icons. We used 4 different icons. The one was for if it was nitrogen fixing, if it provided forage for bees, whether it was a good at soil stabilization, and or like a pioneer plant. So I think those were the 4 the icons that we used. And then this particular case study, we didn't go to the farm, but Benny Diederichs, who came along on the field trip, told us about it. It's St. Kilda near Robertson, and I didn't know whether we should put it under cover crop or under bee forage. And I'm not going to tell you what happened, but it's a fascinating story. And basically, he was working with a farmer, and they had 2 blocks of plums, and they were only 1 year apart. So they were effectively the same crop growing on the same soil, but the only thing that was different was the cover crop. And the one block produced like 10 tons per hectare more than the other. It was a massive difference, and they couldn't understand why. And it's got something to do with pollinators and something to do with the cover crop. So you'll have to read the book to find out. So just to end off, where do we go from here? Well, we'd love you to look at the booklet, so download it, copy the link and download it, or otherwise you can contact WWF and get a hard copy once it's been printed, which is hopefully in about 2 weeks' time. We would love to have feedback or suggestions on the booklet. We're looking for more examples. Can you think of any other farmers or landowners that are working with biodiversity in a creative way? Because we'd love to expand the number of case studies. Because the one thing we did pick up is that these farmers seem to be really swimming upstream. It's not like they've got a lot of support. You've got to figure it out. You've got to do things by trial and error. So it takes courage actually, and resources, of course, but also it's a whole sort of approach. It's a philosophical thing really, and it helps to surround yourself by people that think in the same way, or at least be inspired by or have someone to talk to. So these case studies we are also hoping will serve as a way of bringing together people that are wanting to move in this direction. So, and we could easily add case studies to the online version. We also wondered whether there shouldn't perhaps be we would like to create a community of practice. In other words, can there maybe be a network of farmers for site visits or farmer days or for shared learning? Because in the same way that we learn so much by going to the farm and listening to, for instance, at Hartenberg, the farm manager talking about his regenerative, it's in the seeing and talking that you learn. You could also follow the social media of WWF called Follow the Sugarbird. And please do tell people about this booklet. We really don't want it to just be sitting online. We want it to be useful, and people need to know about it. And I feel that there's also an opportunity here to grow the knowledge base. In other words, we could be using our naturalists to create projects so that we have plant palettes for specific areas to make it easier, because that's often a first stumbling block, is that one doesn't know, well, what should I really be growing in my area? And also to encourage the network of people that are growing these plants. I must just say, throughout the booklet, we've said consult a rehabilitation a specialist, because it is a specialist field. And even, for instance, when you're planting, you want to have plants from the right genotype. You want them from your local area. You don't want to be bringing in plants from 100 kilometers away. So there's quite a lot of levels of detail in this whole field of farming with biodiversity. I think that's from me.
Thanks, Marika. Yeah, I'll stop sharing. We're all good.
Well, on behalf of the audience, I just want to congratulate the three of you. Whenever, just for the audience, for those of you who are not absolute plant lovers, although I assume you are, anytime you get three enthusiastic plant, when they said it was fun, it was work fun. They talked nothing but plants the whole time. And the synergy between the three of you is obvious, and that publication is a brilliant start to the change that needs to come. Well done, congratulations, and thank you so much for coming to share it. Because we're a little bit tight for time, please post your questions in the chat, and the three authors will respond to all your questions there, while I turn to Ivan. Ivan, if you switch on your camera, welcome. Ivan is going to be following a similar conversation about rehabilitation, more than restoration, I think, using grasses and within grasslands. Ivan is a horticulturist, similar to me, so we follow the botanists. And he has been focusing for his whole career on grassland and wetland rehabilitation. He's a plant propagator, he's a plant breeder, and very interestingly, he's the developer of a new living wall system called eco-green walls for food production and urban greening. He's also the co-author of a book called A Practical Grass Selection. So Ivan, thank you so much for joining us. Over to you. It's going to be great hearing what you have to say.
Hi there. Hi, everybody. Yes, I wanted to talk about, everybody's talked about the plants and the pellets that you use. And I thought something that I've come around seeing lately is that there's a bit of a misunderstanding about the whole issue of that, or really the difference, and Rupert actually touched onto it, is the fact that the difference between rehabilitation and restoration. And because the two are so different but so close to one another, that I thought I must just cover that a bit. Okay, firstly, rehabilitation is trying to fix in the short term a major disaster and prevent further loss of soil through soil erosion. So the approach is to stop the source of what's causing the problem. So once you've stopped the source, then you usually use just a few grass species, generally 3 or 4, 5, 6, 7 commercial species that they usually use for rehabilitation. Restoration is another story. Restoration is the real aim. That's what we will try and work towards, is to try and get as many species into the system to restore. And restoration means to try and bring back, and I want to emphasize the fact that trying to do it, because it's impossible to get a site back to exactly what it was before. So we try and bring it back to as close as possible as it was in previously, or in what exists in nature. And there is a often used a reference site. So a reference site is a place in nature where you have a similar habitat, and that is then your objective, is where you're going to with this whole thing. We want to the whole process consists of basically three. Okay, firstly is your objective. You cannot do anything without having an objective. And this cannot be just a haphazard, restoration. If you want to waste money, you must just do it, on impulse. It is a planned process of getting to where you are now to where you want to go to, and where you want to go to depends on what your objective is. So your objective can be, for instance, a pasture. That's what's happening often now on some of the rehabilitated landmines. Many of the clients want to, instead of bringing back nature, they want to establish something more economical, and then they convert it into a pasture. It can also be a landscape. And in the landscape, you do have two options. Mainly is the normal landscape, the small landscapes in gardens that we see, or it can be in natural areas that we want to establish. And lately, in the past, natural areas in a city was usually bigger areas, parks and wild areas. And lately, with the big problem that we have, and in future also the problems with water, many people are moving away from Kikuyu lawns. They take it out and they replace it with indigenous veld grasses, interspersed with or interplanted with indigenous bulbs and plants. And so you have actually smaller areas of indigenous planting. And there's some research also done at the University of Pretoria that we've done with Ida Breed, that did a doctor's degree on urban areas and urban wildlife. And so just to prove that you can, in a very small space, create a quite a biodiverse natural habitat. Further on, to do your planning, you need to look at the whole process. The natural ecological process consists of four things. The one is the structure. The structure is actually the habitat. That is, what does the site consist of? What is the habitat on there? And that is usually things that we cannot really change. That's the climate, the water on it. It could be wetlands. So we need to know what the habitat is. Once you know what the habitat is, you know what the structure or the composition of it will be. So so your structure determines what the composition will be like. So if you know what the habitat is, you can select your plants according to what's suitable for that area. So the structure determines the composition, and the composition consists of the different plant species, the animal species, the numbers that will occur on that, and the biodiversity determines again what the management will be. So you cannot, and usually, as a general rule, the smaller the areas are, the bigger the involvement of management will be onto that. You cannot just do your rehabilitation and just leave it. If in the bigger the areas, it can look after itself, but smaller areas need to be be managed, and that is cutting the grasses, managing fires, the watering, etc. So once you have your management in place, that will determine how successful you are. So basically, the whole thing comes down to management. And so if you have your structure, you have your composition, you have your management, that will determine how successful you are. We usually work on our objective is usually to try and, if we work with the rehabilitation work, we try and incorporate as much biodiversity as possible. And the idea is, and that is something that I worked out for myself, so you won't find it in the book, and that is, I say that biodiversity determines biodiversity. What it means is that more biodiversity you have, the more biodiversity you will get. So by planting 100 plants of different species, you will get a lot of different other species that will come in, as far as the pollinators and the soil biota that we cannot even see. And therefore, we try and bring in as much biodiversity as possible. And so the higher the level of your structure, your composition, your management, the higher the level of restoration that you have done. And in the process of doing that, you need to have your whole rehabilitation or restoration structured. And the way we work is called the SMART approach. So it means that it must be specific. So you cannot just fiddle around. You must specifically know exactly what you want to do. This is where the objective comes in. And so you need to know, it must be specific. It must be measurable. So you need to know exactly how big the whole project is. It must be agreed upon. It means that all the stakeholders must have an input into this, and then it must be realistic, and as far as the budget goes, and the timelines, and it must be time bound. So it means that it needs to be there must be a beginning and an end. You cannot just go on forever. So if it's a long process, that's fine, but as long as you know that you try and stick to that. So that's basically the process of rehabilitation and restoration. And so this is what we try and achieve, is to try and just structure this, whatever we do, with the plants and that we have in mind, how we're going to incorporate it into the project. And that's my story.
Well, Ivan, thank you very much. It is not the easiest thing to give an overview of, and people often, use the incorrect term, and that was wonderful. A really, really great way of explaining to us what we need to do and what the difference is. And we appreciate you coming along to share that with us. If all the panelists could please turn on their videos, just so that I can say thank you to you all, and thank you to all the participants, the viewers that joined us today. Wishing you all a very happy, peaceful, and safe festive season. And we'll see you next year for the webinars in February 2025.
Sorry, there was a question that Shelley wanted to take live.
Yes, please
in the
do, Shelley.
Q&As. Yeah.
Not necessarily.
you.
I think I pushed the wrong button, but okay.
Go for it. You're in it now.
I'm in it now. The question is, why focus on wine farms for this project? Okay, so I'll try and be really short and sweet, but basically within the Cape Floral Kingdom, there's quite a bit of pressure on the habitats because of the vineyard expansion. So that happened to be an audience of farmers that we work with as conservation champions with WWF. And so it was a natural starting point, but it's not the only viewpoint, and we welcome working with a variety of different farms. That's that.
You managed to make that very short and sweet. Is there anything else any of you would like to add or to say before we say goodbye? No? Job well
Just
done.
happy holidays, and always lucky to be on these webinars with everyone.
Thank
Yes,
you.
likewise. Thank you for having us. Enjoy
you.
a restful season. Bye.
Well.